For those that aren't familiar, Glenn, and I've got a pleasure to talk to you once before, you are
You bet.
Regenerative Ranch. You've been doing it a long time. You're up in Idaho at Alta Spring Ranch. Can you give us a
Yes.
little more background detail for those that don't haven't heard of you before?
Oh, sure. Alder Spring is a regenerative ranching operation that is also certified organic and 100% grass fed. We've been doing it for 28 years, and now we're probably one of the largest contiguous certified organic operations in the world. We're on 46,000 acres of wild rangelands that kind of about half of them are rangelands, that are grassland, sagebrush, and the other half are forests that go all the way up to subalpine tundra. So range starts at about 4,000 feet, goes all the way up to 10,000. I have 7 daughters who happen to be all old enough now to be on the cow crew. And so we actually live with our cattle. This year we had about 410 up there on the range, and we live with our cattle 24/7 up there because it's a true wilderness. We have a lot of wolves up there, a lot of bears, a lot of mountain lions. So there's a lot of predation that can go on if we don't live with our cattle 24/7. But what that's done for us is enabled us to kind of micromanage exactly where the cattle graze and select the plants that they graze day to day. And what it's done for us is created a very phytochemically rich beef. I've actually embarked in a study with some researchers from throughout the country, metabolomics researchers from Duke University, who are actually analyzing Alder Spring right now. And to their great surprise, they're finding that there's this phytochemical richness in there, scores of phytochemical compounds that are showing up in our beef. And one researcher even said to me, well, I don't have to become a vegan now because I could just eat your beef, because there's so many plant compounds that are showing up in it. And it's because they're grazing this wild rangeland that has 2,500 native plants on it. I know that. I'm not a plant person. My wife is. She's a PhD botanist. Her name's Carol. She's my better half by far, but she has identified most of those plants up there. And it turns out that our cattle will kind of wine and dine their way through that. And what we do is facilitate their selection by strategizing where we're going to take them each day to kind of embark on that journey of picking up those plant compounds. Phytochemical, by the way, is just a fancy word for saying plant compound. So these are unique compounds that only originate in plants, and we need them in our human condition. And as carnivores, I'm a carnivore. I'm picking it up through the meat we eat, and we pick it up through fish, we pick it up through all kinds of things. We pick up those critical compounds for our health. And I don't even know what they are, Shawn. That's up to you. You're the doc, but I'm just the rancher. But I do know that when I pay attention to eating the right amounts of our beef and balancing it with other proteins, carnivore proteins, I feel great. And I think the reason that we feel great when we get on this diet is because we're picking up those necessary compounds that originated from the plants our animals eat. So that's exciting for us. So, first of all, for us, it was certified organic and grass fed. Those were big things for us. But now I'm realizing on this wild kind of journey that we take our cattle on. The cattle walk actually 600 miles every year. And my daughters and a bunch of good crew members that we hire from all over the world join us on that trip where we basically just live with the cattle up there. We take them on this journey, and it's a journey of picking up this nutrition that's actually 1/3 of the United States is grazing land, is dry grazing land. And so we have this huge opportunity here in the US to actually embark on this journey all over the place and see these lands, these dry grasslands, instead of as wastelands that people couldn't homestead. I now see it as this unique resource that for many years was just thought of as a wasteland. And we instead now realize, oh, wow, there's so much opportunity here for, creating food for humans, creating excellent food for humans. So that's what we do, Sean, in a nutshell.
And that's a very, very amazing thing that you do, and it's something that, and I always try to point this out and thank people for doing that for us, because it's a lot of work, and it takes obviously training and skill and talent and desire, and the willing to do that. And other people want to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and software guys and work in school teachers, and some people do that, some people feed us, and so. I think that's a great thing. I think that's that concept that these animals that we eat, that they are bioaccumulating nutrients. I mean, they're concentrating these nutrients, and that's why animal food is so much more
exactly
nutrient dense and nutrient bioavailable. I mean, it's just an easy, it's like making a giant multivitamin and sticking it in a,
I get it. You're totally, I totally get that.
And the phytonutrients, and it's probably stuff we don't even know yet. I mean, this is the one thing we're seeing is, people that exclude animal products from the diet, we're finding, well, maybe now it's choline, now it's taurine, now it's creatine, all these compounds that we're finding that have these beneficial effects, and these people that are excluding them, they don't even know. They're in 5 years, they're going to find out, well, I needed to supplement this and that and that and that. And so, and then the fact that the animals can bioaccumulate all these phytonutrients that we hear about, because clearly, it's like I said, I mean, the animal's eating grass or, in your case, all kinds of different forage, and some of that stuff is winding up in the meat and in the fat, and we're getting it anyway, regardless. So it's like one of these things where where are you getting your phytonutrients from? Well, I'm getting it from the animal.
Exactly.
Honestly. Yeah. So I think that's exciting. Let me just get right into this, because I want to, there's recently, thankfully, been a little bit of a pushback and a little awareness about this regenerative agriculture, and I'm doing what I can to try to spread that. And obviously you doing what you do, actually doing it, and demonstrating that it can be done is very important. And we're seeing a little bit of media getting there. We saw A&W just talking about stuff in Canada where they're sourcing their beef from regenerative, and we're seeing Kiss the Ground movie came out, and Sacred Cows coming out, and Soil Carbon Cowboys is coming out. So we're seeing more and more, but we're seeing the pushback from, I can't remember, there's an organization, I think, I can't remember who it is, I think 2017, they did a big giant position paper called Grazed and Confused. I don't know if you ever saw that, but it's basically a refutation of what you do, saying what you do cannot work, does not work, is not scalable, and we should not support it because it's just a bunch of lies. And any soil you recapture it's basically going to equilibrate at a certain point, and then you're not going to be able to get any more carbon. And you're really not actually offsetting the methane that you're producing. Really, because your cattle are on grass or forage longer, they're producing more methane overall, and you can't possibly overcome that with soil sequestration and the biodiversity thing. We would just do better just to let wild animals take over. Yeah. What is your thought when you hear that? And this is coming from people that say, and they use these, world leading experts that have said this. And I see these are people that are basically more or less trying to push for a plant-based, sort of really industrialized food system is what we're seeing more of that. But right. So anyway, what do you say have you seen these criticisms, and can you address that?
I got a brother who's a practicing MD in Boise, Idaho, and he's a vegan. So that's where it starts from, Sean. I've related your story to him a number of times, and but he's pretty intractable, and as a result, that's a good place to start because I just can't convince him. So I try. But so there's two halves to this, and the first half starts with me in my previous life working in all aspects of agriculture, but I worked on a commercial soybean and corn farm in the Midwest in Indiana for a while. And the image that keeps coming back into my head on those fields, and you can Google this, you can Google cornfields, you can Google soybean culture, and you'll see a biological desert, pretty much through all of soybean agriculture, through all of pea agriculture. The peas are driving some of these Beyond Food and Impossible Burgers. They're grown the same way as soy is, and these crops are just essentially biological deserts, and they're certainly not sequestering carbon. So there's a huge fallacy associated with that whole movement of veganism and their associated claims for carbon capture. It's just simply not true. And the irony is that we're using a ton of petroleum in terms of fertilizers, herbicides, associated chemicals that are needed to grow those plants in a non-competitive, non-pest competitive, non-weed competitive zone, that there's an incredible amount of petroleum input going into that. And then there's simply the culture of it through, running that big green tractor, right? And burning those fossil fuels and the manufacturing of those tractors. For some reason, those things are not adding up in the mind of those individuals. And it's like, I want everybody to just get out there in the heartland and take a look at that. Because right now, here's the fact of the matter. We have bare soil in the United States. We have bare soil in all industrialized agricultural nations. And the bare soil equivalent right now we have every year in the United States exceeds like 7 of those big heartland states. That's just absolutely naked, bare soil post-harvest. And, and there's no carbon in bare soil. It's simply a hydroponic plant medium that all these amendments are applied to. So there's no living soil, and living soil is the key for carbon capture and carbon maintenance in soil. And whenever we expose it, we're bleeding carbon off. It's volatilizing into the atmosphere. And that whole process of vegan type production agriculture is severely flawed in terms of carbon capture. So, that's a very frustrating part of the argument to me. It's like, because have you not been on those farms? Have you not seen that stuff? You have no idea of how, just common sense will tell you that this is not a carbon capture scenario. The other part of it is the carbon capture that we're experiencing on Alder Spring. Right now, we've done kind of a cursory life cycle analysis based on soil tests. And right now, just very conservatively on the ranch, we're sequestering 1.5 to 3 times as much carbon as we're releasing into the atmosphere in terms of carbon equivalents. So that includes methane, that includes any petroleum use we have, and we have very little petroleum use. It's an animal-based system that we run on. We live on horseback during the summer. Our cattle are on foot the entire summer. Our cattle are the harvesters. And as a result, we've been able to be pretty good about the carbon sequestration equation. The other thing we're finding out on the range, we had a soil scientist spend a lot of the summer here with us. Her name is Nicole Masters. She's fairly world renowned as far as soil health and soil biology. And we did some sampling up on our rangelands, and we come to find out that where we're practicing this regenerative grazing technique, we are now twice the amount of organic matter that we were previously. And so that's something that's not even in the calculation. And my guess is that that's going to up us to about 10 times the amount of carbon that we release in terms of what we actually sequester and capture. And, people think, yes, that's a limited thing. And there's truth to that. If you just look at a very small portion of the soil profile, you look at those top 2-3 inches of the soil profile, typical is the top 6 inches. That's what most people look at. And sure, there's probably going to be a place where we plateau on that carbon sequestration in that 6 inches of soil profile. But Shawn, the soil continues way beyond that 6 inches. If I dug a hole here on the ranch, we have 10 or 12 feet of topsoil mixed with volcanic cobble up on that range. There's a lot of topsoil down there. And when we dig deep soil pits with a backhoe that are way too deep for me to dig with a shovel, we find traces of carbon, and you can actually see this with your eye. You can see carbon falling deep roots way, 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 way down into soil profile. And for, in your and my lifetime, we will not see the end of deposition in deep soil as far as carbon goes. And then there's actually one third part of this thing that, just as a common sense thing, and this is something I could tell, a grade schooler, a first or second grader, and they would get it. Prehistorically, before we came along, just bison, there was 60 million head of bison estimated running around, not the North American continent, but just the heartland of America. And our annual kill on cattle in the United States, this is from sea to sea, from California all the way to, the East Coast. Our annual kill is around 29 million head. And so what I'm saying is this land, unmanaged, just in the heartland, used to produce 60 million bison. 60, and the estimates vary widely. It's anywhere from 50 million to 100 million head. There's just not a lot of good way to, census that data. But based on, prehistoric records, based on historical records, when they started killing them all off, those numbers are just very conservative. And that's not even counting, incredible amounts of other four-legged biomass, antelope, elk, you're not even, so, prehistorically, we were in this sweet zone of a grass-fed culture. It wasn't an agriculture because we had nothing to do with it, but it was a natural culture of tons and tons, literal tons of animal protein. And we didn't have a carbon problem then, Shawn. So what's going on?
Yeah, and that's the thing. We've often heard the number at the buffalo, but I've heard this tremendous number of elk and antelope, and
yes.
I mean, just the numbers were probably in the hundreds of millions. When we add it all up, prior to European conquest of North America, for sure. But but we just see this persistency. What you can't do can't be scalable. There's not enough land. We're going to run out of land. There's not enough productivity. And I know you've talked about, one with the soil, offsetting the soil with the carbon, which is, if you can get 10 times more than you produce into the ground, that's pretty impressive. And I've talked to Alan Williams. I'm sure you're familiar with Alan.
Yeah.
But he has talked about, if we could convert, 40-50% of the land, we could pretty much offset all the carbon produced in the entire United States by all forms of, carbon emissions, whether it's, energy sector, transportation sector, industry sector, cement manufacturer, which produces a ton. But then the question always goes to, well, but you're not going to be able to, feed as many people because you can't be as productive. And I know you've said you've produced gains equaling feedlots on your forage. You've been able to run more animals on the same amount of land that you used to use. So let's talk about a little bit about scalability and what's available. And I know you said there's this great untapped resource. So let's delve into that a little more.
So if we tend to think of the heartland first. So let's talk about that. The heartland being those Midwestern states that were formerly tallgrass prairie. Tallgrass prairie, 6 to 10 feet tall, big blue stem dominated, but many, many plants. I've checked in, botanical records from the 1800s, 1700s, that postulated way back into the 1700s. The actual inventories would occur in the 1800s. 2,000 plants, very similar to what we had in diversity on our current rangelands here. So you got this tallgrass prairie with up to 2,000 different plants in it, just a huge, huge biodiversity stream. And you look at the biomass on top, and that's just simply one small part of the equation. When you dig the hole in the ground, these carbon-rich soils go down 12 to 15 feet. So you're looking at this huge, huge possibility of forage production. And that's the simple reason that the buffalo did so well, that those pronghorn did so well, that the elk did so well. It's because it was just virtually never ending in terms of forage resource. So now we've taken that soil and squandered the value of it and actually lost most of the organic matter. We took it from what was probably a 9 to 10% organic matter, And now a lot of Midwestern soils are under 2% organic matter. And it's because, we've just created these monocultures of corn and soybeans on probably 90% of that heartland soil. So we've really compromised the value of the soil because we've mined all the organic matter. We've lost a lot of the topsoil. And now we're just growing these simple monocultures on there. So the crazy thing about those monocultures is that I think the number that I recently read was upwards of 40% aren't even used for food. We're putting them in ethanol plants. And, many of us have read the whole kind of life cycle analysis of how methane or how ethanol production, is really kind of a losing battle. Without the federal subsidies, we would not see ethanol fuel in our fuel pumps where we pick up gas. It wouldn't be there because it just simply doesn't cash flow without federal subsidies that keep that ethanol thing going. So anyway, we got 40% going to something that doesn't even work. Okay. And that 60% is going into various types of food production, and various types of food production means not human food. Okay. It's going into feedlot, CAFO production, CAFO, which means confined animal feeding operations of hogs, of livestock. So there's a huge amount of petroleum investment in putting that all together. And I would submit, just based on that prehistoric data where we look at those animals, that those systems were far more efficient than we are with our reductionist industrial food supply generation on corn and soybean ground. So to me, it's like if we just could turn part of the Midwest into the something that mimics the grazing system that predates us, of course we're going to be able to grow that food supply. It's kind of a no-brainer just in terms of what the biomass, what the protein, four-legged biomass was before we showed up. And it was only on those Midwestern states. It wasn't spread across the entire country that we've spread this type of agriculture from California all the way to the East Coast. So, that's not, that's misinformation, Sean, in terms of the efficiencies. We're finding it kind of another way on these so-called wastelands that we run on. These are lands that the homesteaders did not want. They said, well, there's not enough precipitation up there on those ranges, on those forest lands. Well, we're going to leave them for just grazing of livestock. And it was kind of this kind of waste view. And that's still fairly prevalent in a lot of ranchers today. But instead, we're finding huge opportunities there in the regeneration of that. To produce food and sequester carbon through that regenerative process. So those are really exciting things to me. These are virtually unused lands. These are virtually unthought of lands in terms of actual food production. Right now, we're producing food that finishes up there on these rangelands and then finishes also on our home ranch here. And this is, it's a pretty closed system. We're not, doing any CAFO. We're not importing any feed or foodstuffs. It's all on this one small family ranch that we finish about 400 head a year. And for some reason, people don't see those dry grasslands as an endpoint in food production. They see it as this place to put their mama cows, grab the calves off and throw them in a CAFO in the Midwest. And so what's actually happening now numbers wise is it's only 3 to 5% of all the animals that end up as finished cattle spent part of their lives on these ranges. And instead we could look at it and say, no, let's turn these ranges, let's turn these grasslands into an actual finishing paradigm to where these cattle actually end up getting finished. And Sean, if you just roll back the clock about just 100 years, that's the paradigm that was going on. I mean, my neighbors would finish cattle. They're gone now. They've long passed away. But the ancestors of my current neighbors, the grandfathers of them, used to round those cattle up directly off the same ranges we use, trail them to a railhead, and that railway train would take them all the way to the Chicago stockyards or to Sioux Falls, and they would enter the food supply. And these are the stakes. These are the stakes, guys, that would hit the New York restaurants, that would hit the Chicago steakhouses, and during the high economic point of the flapper 20s. These are where the steaks originated from. They did not come from feedlots. So all we need to do is roll back the clock to that point where we had a grass-fed agriculture that was de facto. It was before feedlots, before the advent of corn for, this efficient, so-called, quote unquote, efficient aspect of energy feeding directly to cattle to get them to finish in a confined situation. All of our cattle in those days came through this same grass-based system, got on a train and ended up at a stockyard somewhere where they got processed. And that's what fed the American public, and then, you'd roll back the clock just a little more to the time before settlement, and it fed itself. So I think, all we need to do is just look at history to determine whether or not we can feed ourselves, and look, just learn from nature and learn from what nature used to de facto produce for us.
Let's shift gears a little bit, because I know you kind of mentioned this, and there's been a lot, obviously, here in California in the West this summer, and it's not that it doesn't happen every summer, but it gets a lot more attention lately. We've seen a lot of fires, and we've seen some people using animals to help mitigate that. I've seen some goats grazing and talking about eating fine fuels, and you said that there's a lot more to it. Using horses and basically sort of moving those animals in the right way. How can we use animals to improve and make the land more fire resistant? Because that's obviously a problem. So
in California, you got a unique premise in the offering, but the biggest thing I think we need to do is convince the people there that live there that this is a viable option. And here's the problem with fire. And I was a fire ecologist. I was forester, professional forester for 15 years before we got into ranching. I have written prescribed fire plans, have embarked on prescription fire. I've fought fire for a while on wildland fire crews. So I had a lot of experience with fire and forestry before I got into this cattle thing. And it's interesting that things are kind of realigning now for me, because ironically, we're in being affected by fire, even in our grazing scenario that we run on public lands with, for instance, we lost 8,000 to 10,000 acres of our grazing land just 2 years ago through a gigantic wildfire, California style wildfire. So, these questions certainly come to mind. How can we use our livestock to mitigate this fire effect, especially in California? So what we've done for now nearly 100 years through the advent of Smokey the Bear is we've gotten into this scenario where we've been very reactive with regard to fire instead of proactive. And there's a little bit of prescribed fire going on, but just very little. It's for instance, I was talking to one of the local foresters here for the Forest Service, and they were telling me about a really big prescribed fire project that they had embarked on. And this forest manages about 2.5 million acres in central Idaho here. And I said, wow, that's exciting. What's really big? And it was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 acres. And you take 500 or 1,000 acres and compare them to the 2.5 million that they have forest on, and it's really quite nothing. It's absolutely nothing. It's a drop in a bucket. So if that's, the interpretation of being truly proactive, I think, they got a long way to go in terms of what that paradigm looks like. So, and livestock and controlled grazing of livestock, like you mentioned, goats. There's some people doing really great work in California with goats right now, but the problem is the scale. So let me give you an example. I was in Santa Rosa, California, a couple springs ago, and I was visiting a friend of mine. For those of you who don't know, Santa Rosa is about an hour north of the Bay Area, and it's right at the edge of where these annual grasslands and the Coast Range come down into that valley, and then they roll up into the foothills of the Sierra. So you get these grasslands on both sides of that Central Valley. And just north of Santa Rosa, you start getting into the forests, northern forest of California. So it's a very high vulnerability fire area. And I'm visiting this friend of mine in the subdivision, and we came through the subdivision on the outskirts of Santa Rosa, coming through from downtown, and we stopped at his house, and I looked out the window when we got there, and I looked out the living room window and said, what happened? Because looking out his living room window to the outskirts of Santa Rosa, the subdivision continued as indicated by the curbing, the sidewalks, the pavement, but everything was gone. It was like just a clean slate. It was just wiped clean of any homes, of any trees, of any structures at all. And I said, what happened here? And he said, this was a wildfire that came down into Santa Rosa and actually burned that entire subdivision. And just beyond the subdivision, Sean, was a grassland, coming off the Coast Range. And it was an annual grassland. So annual grassland means it grows back from seed every year, and it's a huge amount of volatility, with regard to fire and vulnerability, because basically, we call California the Golden State, and a lot of people think that's, from the gold rush of 1849 and all these sorts of things. But the reality, I think, of the Golden State is when you see those hills in California in August, they turn gold, right? They just totally turn gold. And it's because there's 900 invasive species that moved into California since the Spaniards started colonizing it. And it was brought up on ship ballast from the Mediterranean. And it basically replaced all those fire resilient native species that used to cloak the California foothills. So anyway, now you have this huge volatility in these annual grasslands that go all the way down across the Central Valley, all the way up into the foothills of Sierra, start at the Pacific Ocean, go all the way through that band. And when a match hits them, we know what happens. Those suckers burn, and California gets hot, and it's especially hotter now more than it's been in many recent years. And I think the climate is indeed changing. If we don't think it is, we just need to look at the evidence and see those temperature gradients. And it's, I think climate change is as much of an effect of how we manage our land and how we retain soil, water, and soil temperature. When we open stuff up through piling or overgrazing, and we're putting those soils vulnerable to drying, and it's affecting our friends downwind, our downwind neighbors. So we've actually, in agriculture, have had as much to do with climate change as the industrial coal burning power generator types, So anyway, we have this annual grassland, and it's extremely fire vulnerable. And when that grassland catches fire, it'll just burn whatever's in its path. And that includes homes, that includes businesses, that includes people, that includes, everything that we hold dear in California. So, my heart goes out to those people living in those fire vulnerable zones, but we've created a monster there. And how can we undo the monster? And it didn't really click on me until I talked to a guy named Dr. Fred Provenza. I don't know if you've ever met him, Sean, but he's a great guy, and he's done a lot of research on this aspect of grazing and animal wellness, and our wellness associated with those two things. And he partnered on a book. I actually have it here on my shelf. It's called The Art and Science of Shepherding. And here you can see on the cover, there's a shepherd right there. And I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can kind of see it. There's a huge band of sheep here extending over these hills in a concentrated kind of paradigm, moving across the alpine landscape of Switzerland and France and Italy and the Pyrenees. And he explored all these different shepherds and interviewed a ton of them with this friend of his that he wrote the book with, Michel Murray. And together, they explored this art and science of shepherding. And we actually took a lot of lessons from it on how we herd our cattle now across the landscape. And it turns out that through the tourism aspect of the Alps said no more shepherds, no more grazing of cattle or sheep or goats in the Alps is taken away from tourism. And that happened back in the 80s. And, you know, it was kind of an environmental lobby that said we need to get domestic livestock off these ranges and let them be the way nature intended them to be. So what happened very quickly is there started to be a brush problem. And there started to be an annual grass problem in the Alps and the foothills of the Alps. And soon after that, they started to have a fire problem. And when they had a fire problem, they had a smoke problem. Does this sound familiar? So anyway, that actually kind of turned everything upside down in Central Europe. And the government actually came in and said, oh my gosh, we have a problem. We need to get animals back out. And with that came this whole advent of a reinvention of shepherding. And, you know, and it's shepherding that means living with your animals and controlling them. And actually, you know, we took these lessons from Fred, and our, you know, objectives were to maximize the amount of plant diversity or animals intake and protect them from wolves. But it turns out the very same thing we do with these animals through this process we call in-herding, which is shepherding cattle, can be used to establish just very clear eaten to the ground fire breaks, you know. And when I saw that thing in Santa Rosa, the light bulb came on. It's like, oh my gosh, we could have taken this thing out proactively in the springtime, removed all vegetation within a quarter mile of where the subdivision started. And that way we have fire protection, fire resilience if fires occur there. It's such a simple thing. It's remove the vegetation, you will have a fire. And we have this wonderful agent of removal that's actually going to make money and actually going to provide food for people while we're doing it. But the problem is, Sean, it's always us, right? It's always humans that have to be able to deal with this brand new paradigm, you know, of proactivity instead of reactivity, and saying, no, we're going to invest in just a little bit of infrastructure in fencing, elements of electric fencing, getting people trained on herding, you know, whether it be on horseback or foot, and getting the public used to the fact that there's going to be animals right along I-5 grazing this band, you know, that prevents fire from coming down off the Coast Range and racing across, you know, Central Valley subdivisions or whatever. So there's huge opportunities there. The cool thing about goats is they can even put a dent in chaparral communities. You know, if you get down by Ojai and stuff like that in South, you get into these chaparral communities that are just total brush, and they're an absolute nightmare in terms of firefighting. It was always a dreaded thing if you were a firefighter and you got the call to go to chaparral, because it was an atom bomb of fire, you know, and there was virtually nothing you could do. You know, you couldn't help it as a ground pounder. It wasn't like you're going to pound a fire line through some chaparral and say, oh, we stopped it. No, that's ridiculous. It's going to burn right through. High volatility in those fuels, incredible inflammability, and they're just disastrous. And here we have these animals that could reduce all these fuels and save lives, save property. And yet, you know, for some reason we're against animal agriculture, and animal agriculture could be such a simple solution.
Yeah, well, hopefully, you know, enough people will sort of pay attention to this, and we can make a difference with this. 'Cause I think we can. I think as a community, is more of us sort of become knowledgeable about this, we can start to drive the narrative in the direction I think it's going to make the most sense, rather than, you know, we look at these companies, these fake meat companies, Beyond Meat. I mean, they're literally outsourcing a lot of their GMO soy and pea protein to China. I mean, they're growing that stuff there, you know, and that's where they're getting their inputs from right now, which is just, you know, also kind of crazy to think about that. But let me ask you about, because you've told me you follow your cows around and you kind of sometimes taste what they're eating to see what they're chewing. They don't just select grass. I mean, we have this thing that, you know, all cows eat grass, but they eat more than just grass. I mean, tell us a little bit about the variety that they self-select when left to their own devices or presented with a lot of opportunity. How do they like to feed? And what does that do to the meat?
Yeah, so it's all about providing opportunity for them, Sean. So here's like a little case in point. We pick up yearling cattle. We have about 4 producers that raise the same cattle as we do. We're looking for an Angus genetic that's small frame, that will run very efficiently. a walking pasture. I say it's a walking pasture, meaning they have to actually hike up through mountains and stuff like that. And so they have to be fairly compact and small frame to be athletic enough to pull that off for summer. So we're looking for that. We're looking for somebody who's certified organic, obviously, somebody who's 100% grass-fed, and somebody who has the same kind of animal husbandry principles as us. So there's 4 of those people. And animal husbandry means low-stress stockmanship. These animals are not afraid of us when we interact with them. They'll respond to pressure and release. And, sure, animals still see us as a predator, but we use those elements to move them in our favor. And, we create a little bit of pressure and a ton of release, and we get results in how these animals get spread out across the landscape. So we got these 4 producers that do that. So we'll bring, out of the 400 head we take up there for the grazing tour in the summer, about 100 of them are veterans. We call them the seasoned veterans. They've been up there before. They're 2-year-olds now. So this is their 2nd year in the rotation. They know the drill. They know how to get down to the range. It's about 8 miles down our valley and across a bridge across the Salmon River. Animals hate bridges. The Salmon River's in flood stage when we cross it. And we've had kind of a rodeo trying to get those cattle across the Salmon River Bridge on horseback. But these seasoned veterans will say, oh, I remember this. And they'll just cross the bridge. And then all these yearling cattle will follow them. And we find this exact same thing happens when they hit the forages in the lowest elevation parts of our range. And what's exciting is we're watching these 2-year-old cattle. They just go right to it. They remember all these plants. And you're right, Shawn, it's not just grasses. Sure, there's grasses, and grasses still are kind of a major staple for these animals. And these are all native grasses like blue bunch wheatgrass and Salmon River wild rye. But the other thing is they're eating all kinds of forbs, and they're even eating brush like salt brush and greasewood, plants that are really counterintuitive for us to expect our livestock to eat. But they go there, and I realize that they're actually looking for different mineral elements that I can't even, it would have to be science that interprets what those things are. But what we do find when we enter the low elevation part of the range is that they stop eating salt. They have no desire for minerals. They clean up from their winter coats very quickly. Our sickness rate is less than 1%. Our death rate is less than 1% per year. And what that means is, typical run-of-the-mill cattle running through the system, their death rates are, somewhere between 5 and 10. Sickness rates are somewhere between 10 and 15%. So I know that they're picking up nutrition in all this plant diversity by themselves. We're just providing them the opportunity. So what that means is when we go up there on horseback, we take them to new pastures that have high measures of diversity so that they have an incredible choice before them and can manage their own wellness through it. And here's the interesting thing about those 2-year-olds, the seasoned veterans versus the yearlings. The seasoned veterans will go around going through all those familiar plants that they knew about from last year and learn to like. The yearlings will go follow them for like 2 or 3 days. This takes about 2 or 3 days. At first, the yearlings lose weight when they get up there because they're like, I don't even know what these plants are. I don't even recognize them. I mean, it would be like you and I never eating Vietnamese food to just get dropped in a Vietnamese restaurant and say, hey, have fun with that. And we wouldn't even know where to begin, because a lot of it is unrecognizable to the Western palate, So without somebody as your food guide, or, this is actually going to Vietnam. This is not a pseudo Vietnamese restaurant in some Western city. This is actually going to Vietnam to a market and exploring all those options. And if you don't know what they are, well, you're going to come out with only what you're familiar with. So what happens is these seasoned veterans go around grazing all these unique plants, and we watch these yearlings actually following them around, watching them eat, and you'll see their noses go right together in the ground next to each other. You'll have a 2-year-old right here, and then 3 yearlings will be right around there grabbing that same plant, learning what to eat, learning about what the good stuff is. And within 3 days, they're good. They're good to go. They're just picking up all this new stuff and this huge amount of plant diversity. It could be prickly pear cactus they're eating that day. You know, you see them nibbling away at these things and you're like thinking, oh my gosh, a cactus, what are they doing? So, you know, when you're on horseback above them, you're watching all this stuff. And I just love watching the cattle. You know, the interesting thing is people say often to me, where did you learn all this stuff, Glenn? And, you know, we just basically learned it from the cattle. They're the ones who taught us. So that's exciting stuff to me.
Yeah, that is, you know, when you get to observe them, really pay attention and see what they want to do, and they kind of, you know, they're kind of self-replicating, solar-powered machines that work pretty well autonomously. You don't mess with them too much and let them do their thing and give them the opportunity. How hard is that? I mean, do you find, you know, because there's people that do conventional agriculture. They, you know, I know I had Greg Judy on here, and he called it the Columbus method. They just turn them out in May and pick them back up in October or whatever, depending where they're at. And they don't care where they graze. It is kind of, and then, you know, they graze down, they chew it down to bare dirt in certain areas and the stuff they like and the other stuff they don't touch. And so how much more work is it to you than doing something like that? And I mean, on the balance, because, you know, to do it that other way, you know, maybe there's different inputs you have to do, different equipment you need. What is it like your day to day? What's your day to day like? I know you got 7 daughters, which is amazing. And I look at your Instagram and I see them posting in there. Quite enjoy that. Some great scenery, by the way, up there in Idaho. But what's the day to day life like for you typically on the ranch up there?
So during the, you know, right now the cattle are back. They're back from the range because, you know, I'm looking up at that range right now. It was 2 degrees below zero here on the ranch on Monday. This is not Southern California, Sean. It's 2 degrees below zero. And so it's getting cold up there in the ranges, and all those plants are curing out because of the cold. And there's white, you know, I mean, it's snowy up there on top right now. So actually we're still missing 6 heads. So we're still looking for them, hoping that the wolves don't come in and get them. The wolves usually don't descend very hard into our area until, you know, it starts to get really cold, and they start picking up elk and deer that come down and migrate out of the high country, and they work into the foothills. So that's our main concern, is to try to find those cattle before the wolves descend. But the reality is that most of them, you know, out of 410, we're missing 6. They're all here now. They're all here on our home place, and they got here about a month ago. And it's just because their feed efficiency is not really good up there anymore. Once it starts freezing, those plants cure out. So, but starting in the beginning of May, it's when we take them out and put them up there. And we basically start a grazing tour of about 400 to 500 miles during the summer, where they graze at 70 square miles in a path that we kind of cursorily choose in the winter. You know, we'll look at Google Maps and kind of plan on where we're going. We also have GPS with our cattle all the time, so we can generate these satellite maps of exactly every 10 minutes all the way through summer where the cattle graze. So from those things, from those tools, we can strategize about where to graze the following year. And there's 2 objectives here. One is to regenerate those wild landscapes and maintain those native plants. So, you know, our grazing rotation up there is probably an average about 2.5 years. It's about 2.5 years on average that we come back to a given, you know, piece of ground, a given 10 square feet. So we try to, you know, adjust our grazing plan according to that. And that's what we actually live up there. We just live that grazing plan. And what it looks like on a day-to-day is that you're out there with the cattle, you're out there herding them to where you intended to go the day before. You're making plans about the next day and the next few days about where to go based on your just ocular estimates of what the plants look like. And what's crazy is that, you know, one year you'll have tons of this bitterroot milk vetch come up. This year we hardly had any, and it's all dependent on a little climate and rainfall patterns. A lot of people think these native plant populations are very steady state, but they're not. They're extremely dynamic, and they're dynamic not only based on what's above the ground, but also below the ground. I think there's, you know, fungal pathways and stuff that are communicating what the appropriate plant release is for that given year. And so we're trying to take that all in when we're on horseback. There's a crew boss who's running a crew of three or four people up there trying to manage these cattle and keep them all together so we don't have wolf predation or cougar predation or anything like that. But we're taking them up across the landscape in this pod, not too much unlike what that picture of those sheep I just showed you were. And we're strategizing exactly where to take them in terms of what we predetermined the plant diversity is. So we're trying to maximize that plant diversity. It's all about creating choice opportunities for cattle so they can maximize their own wellness. And when they maximize their own wellness, ours gets maximized, because they have picked up all this diversity, right, to maximize their nutrition and speak to their nutrition via their palate. And that is the exact same thing we do. Shawn, sometimes I say I could eat a ribeye every day, but there's some days where I'm like, I don't want a ribeye today. I want, a piece of salmon or, so our palates vary, even as carnivores, our palates vary. A lot of people think, oh, you're just eating red meat. And they're crazy. There's days when I don't want red meat, even though I'm a rancher and I love red meat. I love a ribeye, more than any other piece of meat probably. But there's some days where I just want to eat salmon or I want a piece of pork or chicken, and just like that, these cattle, a lot of times I'll see them mow down blue bunch wheatgrass, which is, a wonderful species. I've tasted it, and I know what the flavor profile should look like for them to really want it. It's like this maple syrupy sweet that you pick up in the inner nose when you put it in your mouth. And I'm like, that's what they're after. But the next day, guess what? They're not eating blue bunch wheatgrass at all. They're going for a whole bunch of little forbs out there, that I didn't even think that they'd want to eat. And it's because they're maximizing the diversity. So that's my main job during the summer, is to make sure myself as crew boss and one of my daughters as crew boss, or Jake, the crew boss, is maximizing that plant diversity so that they can regulate their own wellness by their palate, while maximizing the biological diversity and regenerative aspects of riparian, bringing beavers back, bringing songbirds back into a lot of these degraded rangeland ecosystems. So you're trying to balance that the whole time. You're trying to maximize your cattle wellness and maximize the wellness of your human partners that we serve beef to. And you're trying to maximize the wellness in terms of carbon capture, in terms of bringing beavers back to our landscape. Beavers, huge regenerative force, okay? And when we got our, when we first acquired this rangeland of 70 square miles, 55 miles of perennial creek up there had not one beaver in it. But now we see beavers showing up everywhere. And they're actually crossing huge, vast areas of dry rangeland. These little beavers are going through the sagebrush because they heard somehow through the beaver network that there's good habitat down there that has aspen regenerating and whatnot. And that's so exciting for us to see these beavers showing up out of nowhere. It's like they're getting paratroop, para-dropped in or something like that, because it's like, where the heck did they come from? And yet when they show up, they'll regenerate an entire creek bottom, because they'll build their dams, raise the water table, increase the amount of hydric and riparian plants that go up the sides. They're increasing songbird habitat. They're increasing fish habitat. They're holding soil sediment from running downstream into the Salmon River, affecting anadromous fisheries like, Chinook salmon and steelhead. And they're just cleaning up the whole world, and are revegetating the whole world. And when we see them show up as partners, we know we're doing right.
Glenn, this has been wonderful, and unfortunately, I have to go run and do another podcast here. But I'm getting some complaints in the audience that you keep running out of meat too fast. You need more cattle. Everybody loves your beef, and they want to know where they can get it and how they get it. So, just if you don't mind, let people know if they want to order some of the stuff you have. And then somebody's asking if they can get suet from you. Apparently, you don't sell suet, but. And then also just comment, antibiotics or something you guys don't typically prescribe. Is there ever a situation you think it's appropriate to give a cow an antibiotic? I assume an active infection would make sense, but I mean, in general, preventively, I would say no. I mean, I guess, but where do I get your beef, and quick thoughts on antibiotics?
So the beef, alderspring.com, and Shawn, you're right. And those people who are whining and complaining, unfortunately, I validate their whining and complaints because it does sell out very quickly. But we do post. Here's the insider trading tip. We do post fresh beef every week at 5 o'clock Mountain Time on Tuesday night. 5 o'clock Mountain Time. This is the ShawnBaker Inside Track, the Meat RX Inside Track, guys. And so 5 o'clock Mountain Time every Tuesday, fresh beef. And, I hate it because I'd like to supply everybody. But on the other hand, we don't want to run 4,000 head. I mean, we like what we do and we like the scale of what we do. And, we think very holistically. And, the thing Carol and I, my wife, keep coming back to is holistic is our health, is our wellness, is our joy in what we do and our relationships with each other and our relationships with our partners as well. And right now they're frustrated with us, but that's their problem, not mine. So anyway, that's how to do it. Alderspring.com, alderspring.com, and you'll see the way to the web store. Also, Alderspring Understroke Ranch, Alderspring Understroke Ranch is the Instagram handle. Shawn's right. I mean, my daughters run that. Sometimes I'll put a pontificating post about fire management or something like that. That's kind of, I put in my pipe and was smoking on for a while. So I'll go and vent on there. But more than anything, it's beautiful pictures and quips by the girls, and they do a great job of that Instagram thing. And what was the last thing you wanted me to speak of again, Shawn?
Oh, just about antibiotic usage.
Antibiotic usage. Yeah, so here's an example. Animal wellness is number one. And like I said, our sickness rate is under 1%. That means less than 4 head out of our 400 we produce every year get sick. And so we just don't have any sickness. And it's because they're regulating themselves with this kind of phytochemical richness, I think, is what they're, is how they're doing it. Because we used to run cattle conventionally, and we always had much higher sickness rates in terms of pink eye and foot rot and all these things. We had fly problems. We don't have fly problems now. We hardly see any flies. We don't have any foot rot. We have sore feet because it can be rocky up there, but usually in 5 days we take them out of cow camp and they're back grazing again. So we just keep an eye open for all those things. So infections are very unusual. The biggest problem I have with infection is when we get these crazy Arctic winter snaps that hit us in September, October, where it'll go sub-zero. And the animals aren't ready for it yet because they don't have their winter coats yet. So they get cold. Okay. And when they get cold like that in those changing weather conditions, occasionally I'll get a pneumonia, like we just had one the other day. And I do use antibiotics for pneumonia. I mean, there's holistic things, there's homeopathic things you can use, but I want to save the animal's life. And pneumonia, when it comes in as a Pasteurella pneumonia or Haemophilus type pneumonia, it can kill them in a few days, and you might not have time. So I don't risk it. I just give them the antibiotic and take them out of their program, and I sell them as a full disclosure animal. And we sell them after 18 months post-treatment, so there's no residue issue. FDA says 28 days. We go 18 months instead before we sell them, but it's full disclosure. So they don't show up on our website, with the organic stuff at all. We record keep, just hugely purposely. And we mark those animals on their little ear tag that they've been doctored, so we know exactly who they are. But yeah, so we do doctor them, and we doctor them to save their life because, man, I appreciate what they do for us, and we're going to take care of them, and we're going to do everything we can to make it happen. So that's the reality. It's like between 1 and 3 a year that we doctor, but we do. Absolutely.
That makes total sense. Glenn, once again, thank you very, very much. Maybe we can continue this down in a few months to get some more. Unfortunately, I had to go, but I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody loves this. And thanks for the insider tip. I think on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Central, you might get a little inrush of people calling.
Mountain time, not Central. Mountain time. 5 p.m. And Shawn, I'm going to have the Meat RX crew kind of keep you honest. I think we need to do a Meat RX up here with you
Sure,
on the
sure.
ground with us on horseback. That would be awesome.
I would love it. Yeah, I'd love
All right,
to.
man.
I know I'd love to get up there. You know, maybe not in January, but maybe springtime would be good.
Springtime in the Rockies. Sounds good, Sean.
Good.
All right, cool.
Good. Take care now.
All
Bye-bye
right, thanks again. Take care.